Hello and welcome back to my channel. Recently, I've been reading books about the history of feminism and men's roles in society. I finished a book called Occult Feminism: The Secret History of Women's Liberation by Rachel Wilson, as well as the book A World Without Men by Erin Clary. I would highly recommend both of these titles. Two things have become clear to me. The first is that I thought I had a pretty good handle on what first wave feminism was about and how the movement happened, but I learned that it was more of a top-down imposition rather than a grassroots campaign. I've also learned that if feminists had their way, they would turn society into a matriarchy and eliminate the authoritative roles men hold in society, and if this ever were to happen, it would be a complete and total disaster. This video pertains to the dark and deceptive origins of feminism, as well as what would happen if Western civilization ever became a full-blown matriarchy. Women are, for the most part, ungrateful for the society that men have built for them. Although far from scientific, random polling on TikTok shows how the majority of randomly selected women believe that they don't need men. When asked if women needed men, their answers ranged anywhere from not necessarily to F men, but I wonder if these women have ever really considered what the world would be like without them. What would happen if all the men just disappeared tomorrow? According to the book A World Without Men, that world would be bleak, unproductive, and resembling a third world country, except maybe worse. Due to the technological achievements of Western civilization, primarily the Industrial Revolution, women have been increasingly more involved in the workforce. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, factory owners and Gilded Age elites campaigned to allow women to work outside the home because they could pay them less than men to work in their factories, and more working women meant more consumers. Later on, the invention of the birth control pill would grant women access to positions of power through their careers and lead them to dominate in education and academia. Guns further evened the playing field and led to men no longer having a monopoly on force. It is only through technology that women have been able to transform gender roles and norms. When the suffragists of the late 1800s campaigned for the expansion of women's rights, namely the right to vote, the vast majority of women did not support this movement, even though most people today believe that they did. In Occult Feminism, the book describes how the large number of anti-suffragists and their message were lost to history, which suppresses their existence. Most women at the time did not want the right to vote because they believed it would make them equally responsible for governing society, as well as protecting people and property, and this isn't really possible for women. The anti-suffragists believed that women were a special and protected class and life was good for them. They had more influence and power in areas outside of government within patriarchy. They had faith in their fathers and husbands to run society fairly and benevolently. They also accurately predicted that feminism would lead to the breakdown of the family unit. History has been altered to leave these women out of the story due to something called standpoint feminist theory, which is a postmodern philosophy that says there is no such thing as objective truth, only people's experience of truth. Due to standpoint theory, we have been taught a false history of how women lived prior to first wave feminism. In our history classes, we have been taught that women were domestic slaves who were routinely abused and had no freedom. We learned that women weren't allowed to receive an education and were forced to have children until they died miserably in childbirth. However, according to Rachel Wilson, women's freedom wasn't nearly as restricted as history books make it out to be. Women could choose who they married. They could get divorced. They could work outside of the home. Women were educated and even wrote books. Standpoint theory comes from epistemology and says that a person's perception of reality is dependent upon their social standing, and their experiences are formed from their unique point of view, and therefore there is no objective truth or objective history because everyone has a different perspective on the world. According to standpoint theory, there is only my truth and your truth, but no the truth. However, People's perception can be altered by many things, such as psychosis and drugs, and reality can be misconstrued. Without objective truth, none of us can know anything at all. Standpoint theory attempts to render truth irrelevant. My question is this: if two people have different versions of what happened, whose perspective takes priority? Whose perspective is more valuable? There's an implied hierarchy in that situation. Standpoint theory makes it impossible to question history and is a form of societal gaslighting on a grand scale. In the book Occult Feminism, it highlights the work of several different women who were responsible for the launch of first-wave feminism. One of these women was named Matilda Joslyn Gage, who published an article called Woman, Church, and State in 1893. In this article, she made the claim that Christianity is the enemy of feminism, and she used archaeological findings to support the theory of ancient matriarchies. During the time period in which Gage wrote her article, discoveries had been made of female sculptures and figurines, implying that goddess worship took place in the ancient world in places like the island of Crete, and this was supposed to be proof that those societies were matriarchal and therefore superior to Western Christian civilization. However, despite these findings, there is no hard proof that backs up the idea that these ancient people function daily within a matriarchy. As far as archaeologists know, there has never been a society which functioned under a true matriarchy, outside of a few small outliers. However, Gage, along with her other feminist friends at the time, believed that matriarchy was the only way to advance Western society. Feminists do not want equality. They want superiority and authority. They want men to worship at their feet. They want to destroy all forms of patriarchy and replace it with matriarchy, promising an Arcadian future where women have complete control over society as altruistic rulers who seek peace, mercy, and inclusiveness. The problem is that when women gain power, they are just as likely to be violently cruel with it as men are, maybe even more so. The other problem is that historically matriarchies simply do not work. They have never worked. The freedom and deference women have enjoyed would disappear, and the economic means that produce the American standard of living would come to a screeching halt. Why matriarchy doesn't work. The vast majority of human tribes and civilizations have been patriarchal. A patriarchy is a system in which lineage is traced through fathers, men are considered the heads of household, and the majority of positions of power and authority are held by men. Men do the majority of paid work. They're expected to defend society through a warrior class or military service, and are the builders of architecture and infrastructure that sustain human life. Historically, men were considered to be the main contributors of society due to their physical strength and capabilities, and this is why positions of power and leadership were reserved for them. But there were good reasons for this, both economical and sociological. The goal of every wave of feminism has been to turn society into a matriarchy. A matriarchy is a social construct in which the rulers are female, and power, as well as property, is passed down matrilineally from mother to daughter. A matriarchy is something that conceptually looks like a patriarchy, but instead of men in charge or on top of the social hierarchy, it's women. The problem is that nobody can truly define what a matriarchy is because we have no examples of a functional matriarchy operating in a large civilization. Andrew Tate says that the reason we have so few matriarchal societies showing up in human history is not because there have been no matriarchies. It's because the ones that did exist didn't last long enough to leave a historical record. Matriarchies have, of course, been tried in the past, but because they are fundamentally unsustainable, none of them lasted long enough to leave any history behind. Despite the claims made by some feminists that matriarchy preceded patriarchy in ancient civilizations, there is no proof that a successful matriarchal society has ever existed. There's one small tribe in China that's considered to be matriarchal, and the Iroquois of North America were matrilineal, even though the men were in charge. Goddess worship was common in the ancient world, but that doesn't mean that the women in those societies held more power and authority than the men. Additionally, civilizations with known female rulers, such as ancient Egypt, were not considered matriarchal because even though a woman may have been the figurehead for a period of time, it was only because there were no suitable males who were available to rule. Monarchy is inherently patriarchal because leadership is passed down from father to son, but women can be substitutes if there are no male heirs of age to assume the role as king. This is because the sociological structure of hierarchy is a fundamental element of patriarchy. It's difficult to conceive of how a matriarchy would operate because they are so rare, but what we can know is how our own society has changed rapidly in the past few decades since the sexual revolution took place, and we've seen women flood the workplace, gain consumer power, become politicians, and have full access to contraceptives and no-fault divorce. Our society is more matriarchal now than it has ever been, and the summation of all these changes has had dramatic effects. Candace Owens has said that for the past 10 years or so, we've been living in a rabid matriarchy that has diminished the influence of men and has installed women in positions of power, and that this has caused the further decline of our civilization. Despite the advantages women are granted in family courts and employment, feminists still religiously teach that we are oppressed by men in gender studies courses. If you were to break down the labor force by necessity, the vast majority of jobs held by women are not critical to the functioning of society. Women overwhelmingly avoid STEM jobs as well as the trades. They're overrepresented in areas such as teaching, healthcare, HR, and social work. These are all jobs that rest on a physical and technological infrastructure that's maintained by men. Construction, mining, oil and gas extraction are jobs dominated by men. In a hypothetical all-female economy, nothing would be produced, invented, or manufactured. Men produce 75% of the food. Without men, the electrical generating capacity for the nation would drop by 93%. Only 1/6 of all sewage pipes would be built. Women would have to wire up their own power plants, start working as car mechanics, trade their cushy air-conditioned careers for farming, build and maintain their own internet, and cut their average caloric intake from 3,600 calories to 890 calories. They would be forced to live in closets and grass huts because 97% of home building would be eliminated. According to Aaron Clary, quote, "The lines to the communal toilet would be longer than a Soviet bread line." I read an article that said a true matriarchy would be family and mother-centered and based on maternal ethics. I'll leave a citation in the description below if you want to read more about that. Under a matriarchy, maternal values as ethical principles would create an attitude of caretaking, nurturing, and peacemaking. But if this is true, then why have feminist women done everything possible in the past few decades to dissolve the family unit? The well-known philosopher feminist Simone de Beauvoir believed that women will never be free until they stop getting married and having children. The antinatalist message from feminists is that if you're a woman, marriage and children will make you unhappy and limit your freedom. That doesn't sound very maternal to me. There is one major flaw in the concept of matriarchies that is obvious. Men are the people who actually enforce laws and protect people's rights, including women's rights. Due to the biological disparity between men and women that causes men to be stronger and more durable physically, along with the fact that most men can end the lives of most women with their bare hands, this means that men are the ones capable of allowing a matriarchy to exist. If society does become a matriarchy, it's because men would have allowed it to happen. And so by that logic, it's not a real matriarchy. All men would have to do is say, we're stopping this social experiment, and that would be the end of it. Women cannot impose matriarchy without the cooperation of men, but men can impose patriarchy without the cooperation of women. What would a matriarchy be like? If we want to know what a matriarchal society would be like, we can take a look at our primate relatives. Within other primate species, matriarchy only exists in bonobos. Chimpanzees live in a social structure where there are alpha males, and the high-status males mate with all the females. They spend their time making and using tools, as well as bonding with each other in the form of grooming. Chimps have the highest IQ of all animals. Bonobos, on the other hand, spend all their time engaging in various forms of sexual behavior with each other. Their activities revolve around sex, even incestuous sex. The female bonobos form bonds against the males through sociosexual contact because the females use sex to control the males. Bonobos are polyamorous and use sex for communication and social cohesion, but in the wild they have never been observed to cooperatively hunt or use tools. And I'll leave a citation in the description if you want to know more about that. Within bonobo tribes, there exists full sexual freedom, including all forms of incest. The normalization of unrestricted sexual freedom was part of the ideology of the women who pioneered the second feminist movement. Bonobos' lives revolve around sexual intercourse and nothing else. Compare how they live to how we've been living in the past few decades. More importance is now placed on sex than ever before. Sexual identity, sexual preference, and sexual expression are more celebrated than ever before. There has been an erosion of sexual inhibitions, with polyamory being normalized and replacing monogamous marriage. The sex positivity movement encourages young people to partake in sexual experimentation and orientation, pursuing pleasure as a leisurely pastime instead of something that can result in the creation of another human being. This hedonistic worldview rising to prominence has coincided with women taking over positions of influence and gaining power over men through dating apps. I know correlation doesn't equal causation, but I think this is more than a coincidence. Do we really want to live like bonobos? Is that progress? I was always led to believe it was men who are sex-crazed apes, but I'm starting to think it's actually women. The emergence of OnlyFans demonstrates women's willingness to accept all forms of sexual behavior, no matter the consequences. Modern feminists teach that being a sex worker is empowering. They don't see anything wrong with making money off the weaknesses of men. According to feminism, men deserve to be exploited. I personally don't have any contempt for the young women who make a living off of creating explicit content. In fact, I have compassion for them. Many of them don't realize that they're making a Faustian deal and that their lifestyle choices might come back to haunt them. We live in a highly unforgiving society where the smallest recorded mistake can affect a person for the rest of his or her life, even if that mistake was made a long time ago. The push to remove the social stigma associated with sex workers and promiscuity shows how obsessed with sex our society has become. I think this could be a byproduct of women's ascension to power, and if matriarchy takes over, we can expect more and more tolerance of what were considered to be sexual taboos in the past. In The Coddling of the American Mind, Jonathan Haidt describes a shift that began taking place in the mid-2010s. Riots began breaking out at universities because students started getting emotionally triggered by the policies of their campuses. In 2015, students demanded the resignation of staff members at Yale due to an email that was sent out pertaining to the rules of dressing up for Halloween. A video posted online shows students surrounding a staff member and screaming at him, accusing him of making them feel unsafe and not at home on campus. It's hard to believe that their emotional breakdowns were over Halloween costumes, but it's true. This wasn't an isolated incident. At other universities like Berkeley, students started becoming unhinged due to the content taught in their classes and in the lectures given by invited speakers, prompting the universities to provide comfort rooms for triggered students to retreat to that contained coloring books and puppies so that they could emotionally recover after getting upset over parts of the curriculum of a class. This wave of crippling emotional stability that we've seen correlates with the rise of female students outnumbering the males by a substantial amount in universities. Many of these students had never heard a person speak an opinion that they didn't agree with, and they put all their effort into making sure it stayed that way. Conservative students and staff members have been targeted and bullied into silence, too afraid to disagree with the students who are protesting to get all conservative ideas removed from their university. These female-dominated academic institutions clearly don't support free speech, and they require intellectual obedience to feminist-approved ideologies. Higher education is supposed to be about acquiring truthful knowledge, not the precedence of feelings over facts. This is clearly the origin of cancel culture. I think what's happening on college campuses gives us a glimpse of what's to come if our society continues its matriarchal trajectory. We know that feminists use standpoint theory to rewrite history to suit their bias. They have no qualms with suppressing facts that get in the way of how they want people to feel about feminism. For them, feelings must be regulated. Feelings must be protected at all costs, even at the expense of truth. This is leading to a society in which some emotions are acceptable, but others are not, and any emotional deviance will not be tolerated. In conclusion, matriarchy isn't going to solve women's problems, and it certainly won't solve men's problems either. Women seem to think that if only they could be in charge, everything would be fair, balanced, and peaceful. I've heard people say that we could have a utopia if women were to run the world, but I think it's evident that matriarchy is only going to make things worse. It will further feminize boys, turning them into weak and incompetent men. It will impose communism-like policies that will destroy what's left of our meritocracy. This means that people will no longer be motivated to achieve great things. Marxism looks good on paper, but in practice it causes nothing but misery. And if you think that communism isn't so bad, then you don't know enough about it. The answer is not to replace men in power with women, because power corrupts both sexes. That was the point of the end of Game of Thrones. Even a woman who started off being merciful and kind became a murderous tyrant in the end because power corrupts everyone. The solution for a better world is for women to invest in their children. Raise your boys to become good men by not leaving them at daycare with a stranger for 10 hours a day. Instead of working full-time to give your kid a tablet and an iPhone, focus on giving them a mom and a dad at home if you want them to be advantaged. If you're a woman who's thinking about divorce, instead of prioritizing your sexual satisfaction, work out the differences you have with your husband so you can provide your son or daughter with a male role model. Kids don't need a bigger house. They need values instilled in them. While you spend your life earning a paycheck, your kids are at home with their smartphones, looking at X-rated material, sending nude pictures to each other, and either bullying another kid or being bullied themselves. Now more than ever, we need women to be actively engaged in parenthood. We need women to make being a mother their #1 priority in life. We can't control what men do. And to be honest, today's men are probably not going to change. The women who wanted the right to vote said they wanted the opportunity to determine the future. But if you really want to have a say in the future, put your efforts into raising children. We may not be able to change the men of today, but we can create the men of tomorrow. Thank you for listening and watching my video. If you have any book recommendations for me or any thoughts you'd like to share, feel free to leave me a comment down below. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you in my next video.